4 years ago, I took a year off from teaching to spend the time that I would normally invest in teaching to completely redesign my approach to teaching. Until then, I felt I'd just try to improve things, in a sense, working from a system that's somewhat broken and trying to make some pieces work better. But this gave me the opportunity to actually wipe everything off the table and start fresh. So I used that year actually first to educate myself. I traveled around, I visited a number of interesting programs. I went first locally to MIT to look at the TEAL classroom, Technology Enhanced Active Learning. I observed classes there. I went to Olin College, where I spent many days looking at their approaches to educating engineers. I went to McMaster to look at their integrated science curriculum, Melbourne University. In fact, I traveled around and read and educated myself about teaching. Reflecting back on that 4 years later, it strikes me that we actually should do more of that. We would never think of starting research without educating ourselves. Yet, when it comes to teaching, we just go into the classroom and we do what our teachers did to us, which is what I did when I started teaching here at Harvard over 30 years ago. So as I read, there were a couple of books that actually had a profound impact on the design of this new course that I'm going to present to you today. And one of those books is a book by the beautiful title of Who Owns the Learning by Alan November, who's a consultant for K-12 education. And in the foreword of this book, he starts with the following sentence. Have you ever experienced something, some seemingly random event that made you completely reconsider the very essence of what you believed was true? I was hooked. He recounts in that introduction what happened to him in the early 80s. He lives in Marblehead, and he was a high school teacher in Lexington, Massachusetts. For those of you who are visiting here, an affluent suburb west of Boston. Now, Lexington High School, being in an affluent suburb, was one of the first schools to implement a computer lab, right? I mean, the early 80s was the emergence of the PC, the Mac. So it was a novelty in those days, and not many high schools had access to computing facilities. He was in charge of that computer classroom. On a Sunday morning, he gets a phone call that there's been a break-in the computer lab. He drives from his home in Marblehead to school, parks his car in the parking lot. None of the windows of the computer classroom are broken. He goes inside. The door to the computer classroom has not been forced open. He opens the door, looks inside. All of the computers are still there. There's just one strange thing. There's a student sitting at one of the computers. So he goes over to that student. He says, Gary, what are you doing here? And Gary looks up at him and says, I want to learn how to program the computer. That's when he realized that if somebody wants to learn, they'll do anything. They'll break the law if necessary. You don't have to bribe them with points and crack the whip on that. They learn because they want to. And if you look at small kids, 4, 5 years old, they learn not because we give them lectures and give them points and assessments and force them to learn. No, they learn because they want to learn. We are all born learners. Learning is, in a sense, living. We're all born curious. We're all born scientists. If anything, science does a really good job turning that innate curiosity that we're all born with off. And by the time we get the students, even in a school like this, they don't study in order to learn. No, they study in order to pass any requirements that they need to pass. So the rest of the book talks about how you might restore that ownership of learning that in the ordinary classroom resides with the teacher in front of the classroom to the students. Now, it's a book for K-12 education, so the rest of the book was actually not that relevant for me, but I started to think, wouldn't it be nice if in this course that I teach, where I have engineers and pre-meds who are not taking physics because they want to learn physics. No, they're taking physics because they're told to take physics, and have them own their learning again. But, you know, it's one thing to do that with computers. How do you do that with physics? So it became clear I had to come up with some kind of a Trojan horse that hides the physics. And the Trojan horse that I came up with was a combination of two techniques: team-based learning and project-based learning. The project is there so that I don't have to tell my students, here's my book, learn it, it's good for you. Instead, I tell them, we're going to work on these really exciting projects. And once they're completely hooked on the project, I'll tell you more about that in a second, I tell them, by the way, you may want to have a look at this book. It may help you with your project. So the project is the goal. The team-based learning is there to provide a social responsibility for the learning. See, normally, the student is responsible to the teacher for his or her learning. If you properly implement team-based learning, the students are responsible to each other. And boy, are they sensitive to each other. Much more sensitive than they are to the teacher. Now, a lot of people who implement team-based learning simply take the curriculum developed for individual teaching, the normal curriculum that we have, and apply it in a team-based setting. Bad idea. Because the individual curriculum can be done by individuals. So if you have a team of 5 students, and there's one student who is really good in the material, she or he can say, let me do it. And the others can free write. And then the person who is doing all the work is annoyed that the other people are free writing, and the people who are free writing are not learning anything. Ground rule 1 for team-based learning is make it so hard that even the best student in the class cannot solve it on his or her own. So for a lot of the individual parts of the group, scores, instead of being, you know, in the 80, 90, or whatever high percent, tend to range around the 50 to maybe even 40%. So that even the best student says, whoa, I'm not sure I can do this. And the other students know, well, she might be the brightest student in the class, but there's no certainty that what she says is correct. In that case, everybody has to pitch in. Everybody has to work together. Okay, so how do you go about designing a course like that? I decided to apply something I'd already tried to apply to an existing course, but it's very difficult to do with an existing course. And we've had Carl Wyman here already advocate this approach, backward design. Start from the output rather than the input. Instead of saying, in this course, we're going to cover this content, ask yourself, what do I want at the output end? This is very well described in this book by Grant Wiggins, Understanding by Design. And the idea is that you start with the desired outcomes, and you ask yourself, what am I going to accept as evidence that I've accomplished these outcomes? And then finally, what instructional approach am I going to develop in order to maximize the output? Makes a lot of sense. But for somebody who is, for many years, taught by looking at the input end, the content, topic A, topic B, topic C, you know, it's actually not that easy to let it all go. So what I did was I surveyed all of the faculty here at Harvard who teaches a course that requires an introductory physics course in the physics department, in the engineering department, in chemistry, in biology. And I asked them about the output, what they thought would be a good desired outcome for an introductory physics course, as well as content. We got about 30 faculty who took the time of responding, and out came a set of lists, a set of outcomes, if you want, in 3 layers. At the top layer is a list of competencies. I'm not going to go any details. I'll give you a link so you can download it if you want and look at it, because it's way too much detail, and I want to get into the course, not just at the description of the outcome. These competencies have nothing to do with the course per se. Ideally, I would like to see these competencies across the curriculum. They involve things, you can see it in the background, like design and quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis and so on. Below that layer, I have a set of course goals. And the course goals fall into 4 broad categories. I want the students to be able to engage in self-directed learning. After all, learning how to learn is probably the most important skill in any education. When we give our students their diplomas, that's not when learning ends. That's when it really starts. And unless we equip them with the skills to continue to not only learn, but also assess themselves, it'll be hard to progress. I want them to master the content. I want them to be able to engage in effective teamwork. And I want them to exhibit professionalism, including ethics and punctuality and participation in the course. And then, of course, there's a very much longer list of specific content goals, which spans probably 6 pages. And I'm happy to share those with you. In fact, if you're ever interested in visiting the course, our visitor packet is at that URL, and I'll have the URL again at the end of my talk here. That gives all the details you possibly might want to know. The second thing that became clear was that I had to change the architecture of the room. This is the room in which I'd been teaching for many, many years whenever I taught the intro physics course, Science Center B or C. And you only have to look at this to see that it's completely focused on information transfer and on the faculty member in front, whereas the most important people in the classroom are the students, not the professor in front. By the way, who is responsible for this architecture?
Must be professors.
No, it's not professors. Where does it come from? The Greek, exactly. The ancient Greek designed the amphitheater. What did they design the amphitheater for? For plays, exactly. Did they teach that way? No. If you look at an illustration of the School of Athens, you see a very different pictures. You see people walking around and talk and discuss. In the Sistine Chapel, there's a beautiful painting of the School of Athens. So the Greek knew darn well not to use the performance space as a learning space, but somewhere in medieval Europe, we adopted the performance space as a learning space, and teaching became, in a sense, a performance act. So we had a library in Pierce Hall on the 3rd floor that was not heavily used, and decided to reduce the area of the library and to redesign that room as a learning space. I was on a committee to redesign that. I was also on the committee for the 21st century classroom of the university. One of the first projects was to redesign the classroom in Stone Hall, which became the innovation room. And it was sort of interesting to go through that process. Initially, we had the idea of putting in a lot of technology, the same way MIT has in the Teal classroom. But then we decided, we don't know how people use technology. Let's instead focus on the aesthetics of the room and the organization of the room. The room has only mobile furniture, can be arranged in tables that accommodate 6 people or 8 people or 12 people, depending on how many tables you put together. It's a beautiful space. It has windows all around, which created a problem because we couldn't put whiteboards. They would have been covering up the windows that are on 3 sides. You only see one side that has windows, and you see the only side that does not have window, but the other have even more windows than you can see there, which make this space very attractive. Instead, we bought these mobile boards, which you see a few of them, although most of them have been moved away in order to be able to take the picture. It turns out those mobile boards were the best possible thing, because now, if you're in that room, even if you would like to lecture, you can't. Not only do half the students have their back towards you, 80% of them are hidden by a board when these boards are randomly distributed throughout the space. So this space is focused on interaction and are student-centered rather than the instructor. If I take the microphone and I say, can I have everybody's attention, the students don't even pay attention to me. It's very disconcerting at first, but once you come to terms with the fact that you're no longer the star in front of the room, it's actually probably a very good thing. So I decided also, right off the bat, I would not have any lectures. I can't lecture in that room. And also no exams. I would love to talk about that. some of you here know I've attended the talk I gave, I think 2 years ago, about assessment. If you want to know why I eliminated exams, I urge you to watch the video of that talk called Assessment, the Silent Killer of Learning. The idea is I wanted to take away the need for students to study for an exam. I wanted them to focus on studying for learning. So obviously I was going to use what is now known as the flipped classroom, which I started back in 1990. Initially, in a traditional curriculum, the instructor in the classroom would give the first exposure to the material, and then you send the students to their rooms to go over the material, make sense of it, and create a deeper understanding. If you stop to think about it, we spend all our time as instructors on the easy part, the information transfer. In the 21st century, there's really no excuse for that. Ever since Gutenberg invented the printing press, there have been good methods for transferring information. So let's flip that around and ask the students to take the responsibility for the first exposure in their rooms so that we can use the time with them in the classroom to build a deeper understanding. I'd sort of done that with peer instruction and clickers and then later learning catalytics. Some of you know about that, and it's been sort of growing worldwide as a movement. But this created an opportunity to also rethink the information transfer part. So I'm going to talk about 3 things here. I'm going to talk about the information transfer, the out-of-class part. I'm going to talk about the projects, which essentially are the Trojan horse. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the in-class activities. And then we're going to wrap up with some data that we have collected over the past few years. So let's start with the information transfer. I've eliminated this. How do I replace that? Over the 20-some years that I did peer instruction in Science Center B or C, I'd first asked just my students to read the book. Then in order to provide an extra little stick, I said, read the book and I'm going to give you a quiz. And then later when I found that this extrinsic motivation wasn't really good, I adopted a technique called just-in-time teaching, which sort of has not just a stick, but also a carrot in order to get them to do the reading. But I realized that I'd spend all of my time working hard on making the in-class experience a social experience, right? Peer instruction has students teach each other, interact with each other in the classroom. And deep down, learning is a social experience, not an individual experience. In fact, it's so strange, right? I mean, if you stop to think about it, all of education is focused on the individual, both in the teaching as well as in the assessment, even though society as a whole is a completely collaborative experience. No wonder we produce people who, might be very good working alone, but then when they get out in the workspace, it turns out they don't have the requisite collaborative skills to flourish. So anyway, I said, we have to make the out-of-class component also a social interaction. So we developed a platform, which is now online and widely available, perusal, with which we can actually guarantee every student prepared for every classroom. At its heart, it's simply a social learning platform. The students log in through their preferred social network, and then once they're on there, they can see who else is online on the book. Their little avatars show up. And if they read the book and they don't understand something, they can highlight it, which opens a chat window where you can ask a question. That question then sticks, and after a while, the page will be marked up. You can click on any of these markups, and it shows the dialogue between students. Let me zoom in a little bit so that you can see it. I don't think you can read it, but I'll read it to you. Here's one student who on October 20, last semester, at midnight said, I don't understanding how this combination of factors tells you anything about direction, blah, blah, blah. Then 20 minutes later, or 30 minutes later, another student said, I think you may be able to think about the direction separately, and so on. And 2 days later, another student said, this is a great question to further elaborate. So what you see here is, in essence, an online version of peer instruction, the asynchronous interaction between students helping each other understand the material. Initially, we dove in because, when you read that, when you see that happening, your fingers are itching to dive into the discussion. I quickly discovered that's the wrong thing to do. The ownership of the discussion should reside with the students. Because as soon as you dive in, they take whatever you as the instructor say as the gospel, and they very quickly start to expect you to answer all of their questions and no longer take the trouble of answering each other's question as thoroughly as you might want. Okay, well, I could tell you much more about it. I'm just going to tell you that we use a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic factors to motivate the students to participate, and that we get in an average course that we teach with about 60-some students, 20,000 annotations. The students write more text than the author, me in this case, has written in the book. And I took 25 years to do that. Okay, so let's talk about the projects. How to design good projects, right? We've had many labs in our introductory courses, and in a sense, laboratory exercises are like mini projects, but they're hardly motivating. On the other extreme, you could think of a project that you do for the entire semester in the fall and then another one in the spring, but how do you capture the entire curriculum in one big project? I ended up settling essentially on 3 projects per semester, 6 for the entire year, 1 in a month, so that I could partition the curriculum into 3 bins. We form teams. We do not let the students choose who they work with. In the real world, you don't choose who you work with either. So we basically engineer the team so that we diversify the students according to interest, abilities, and then a number of other measures. Happy to provide more detail later on. Now, in order to design the project, I learned a lot from the business school. I went to observe a number of classes there. And the business school, which makes money actually out of developing and selling cases to other business schools, has a set of design criteria for the cases. And it turned out that those design criteria matched beautifully onto projects. Just replace the word case by project. Here they are. To be successful, the case, or in my case, the project must, 1, require the practical application of skills. So say you teach a finance class in the business school. Well, you want your students later on to be able to determine the market capitalization of a company or a reasonable stock price at an initial public offering. Makes sense, right? What about physics? Well, same thing. You want your students to be able to apply the laws of mechanics to blah, 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 and so on. So that's easily translated. The second rule is, to be successful, the case must be linked to real-world problems. You know how the business school does that? Very simple. They go to the Wall Street Journal, they look at real cases with real companies, and then they change the name of the company so that the students can just Google what the IPO price or the market capitalization of the company is. That's a little bit harder with physics. I mean, I'm sure that in your mind and in my mind, everything we do in physics is the real world. But now imagine not having been exposed to a physics lab, coming into a physics lab and seeing a frictionless track and oscilloscopes and all kinds of things. I mean, would that conjure images of the real world? I thought, am I going to use these labs that, have these sterile equipment and experiment and don't really connect physics to the real world? And then I thought, physics is all around us. The window shades are down, but physics is everywhere. Let's use the real world as our laboratory. Let's not use the equipment in the lab, but let's just use consumer devices. These phones take pictures at 240 frames per second. You could just film the motion of a ball thrown up or a person walking or a bicycle, and then analyze it with 240 frames a second, upload it, track the video, and make graphs. Let's use these instead of sensors that students don't know how they work, and it's all hocus pocus and magic. So I decided to transport the lab to the real world. The last one gave me some pause. In order to be successful, the case must have a component of empathy or social good. Yes, the business school. So, for example, each case starts with the word you. You have been appointed to help a family invest in inheritance. Right? So you're put in a position to help somebody, an entity, a person, or society. How do you do that with physics? I had no idea in the first, but it shows that, we're so constrained in our thinking about teaching because we never give ourselves an opportunity to think out of the box. I'll show you how we did that. So here are the 6 projects, and the names won't mean very much to you. We start with a drag race to warm them up with kinematics. Then they have to build a Rube Goldberg machine that has 7 different steps. One has to have an elastic collision, another inelastic collision, another one has to have a trajectory, one has to involve a pulley and rotational motion, and so on. There are restrictions. One has to have you know what a Rube Goldberg machine is, right? It's one of these machines that does a lot, but it accomplishes very little. In this case, it has to crack open an egg at the last step. And then the students have to measure all of the momentum and energy transfers in the entire machine throughout all of the steps. Now, measuring momentum on a Pascal card with a frictionless card is relatively easy, but also rather non-interesting. Here, you have to use the skills developed with measuring motion with your own cell phone and digitizing the graphs in order to do that. So the physics is actually quite rich. And then the third one, which I'm going to discuss, is the symposium. It deals with the part of the curriculum that has vibrations, oscillations, waves, and sound. So at the beginning of the project period, the students receive a brief that gives them all of the information. How do I hook the students? How many of you know about El Sistema? El Sistema. 2 years ago, Jose Abreu, an economist from Caracas, Venezuela, got an honorary doctorate for starting El Sistema. El Sistema, his name was Jose Abreu. He started in 1965 with El Sistema. He realized, as an economist and an amateur musician, that poverty in the poor neighborhoods of Caracas was a self-perpetuating cycle. Kids went to school, came out of school at 2 o'clock, went back home. Parents are not home, father might be in the prison, mother is trying to make ends meet. There's no television, there's nothing to do. They start playing in the street, and by age 15, they've joined a gang, and later sort of, continue that cycle of poverty and criminality. So he decided that he would use the classical orchestra to do social good. He started in 1965 with 12 students in a garage. Now in Venezuela, in 2015, there are something like 450 students from poor neighborhoods playing in 350 orchestras around the world. Gustavo Dudamel, you've heard of Gustavo Dudamel, right? Conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, is a product of El Sistema. Were it not for El Sistema, he could have been in prison. The first violinist of the Berlin Philharmonic, product of El Sistema. A number of famous jazz musicians, products of El Sistema. Now, there are a couple of beautiful documentaries that have been made about El Sistema. I show my students a little clip of one of those documentaries.
My third night of being in Venezuela, we heard a concert of Gustavo Dudamel conducting the Teresa Carreño Youth Orchestra. I literally had the hair stand up on the back of my neck.
I showed them a little bit more than just this little clip here. In particular, I showed them what happens in the lower grades, grades 1 through 3. There's not enough money to buy instruments for all of these, 500,000 kids in Venezuela. So what happens in the lower grades is that the students design their own cardboard instrument, mute instruments that don't make any sound. And then the teacher plays Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and the students play their mute instruments, learning how to hold them and how to keep the rhythm. I cut the tape and I tell my students, your task is to design a beautifully sounding musical instrument with just recycled parts. And in order to show them that this actually can be done, I showed them a little YouTube that went viral 3 years ago. You must have seen it, or you may have seen it, called the Landfill Harmonic. This is about a little town near Asunción in Paraguay, where the kids rummage around in a dump to find parts from which they assemble instruments. In particular, there's a scene, Google it, don't Google it now, Google it later, the Paraguayan landfill harmonic. There's a scene of a kid playing Bach's unaccompanied cello suites, and it sounds beautiful, and then the camera pans to the cello, which is simply an oil drum. It's almost a cognitive dissonance. And then, of course, I have to fold in the physics. So the students will have to determine what the musical range is of the instrument, what the harmonic spectrum, what determines the harmonic spectrum. Can they use their knowledge of physics to improve the harmonic spectrum? What is the Q factor? What's the sound level? How can you increase the sound level? What is the tuning stability? And how is the tuning stability affected by environmental factors? So a lot of physics and quite a rich environment to do physics. So what are some of the milestones of the project? On day one, they have to get to know each other and set a team contract for the first half hour. So they come into class, we stand at the door and we say, Paul, you are at table 5. Sarah, table 6, we've made the team assignment. And we found that, very often the students would just go to the table, sit there, open their laptop and go to Facebook or email. Students who didn't even know each other, they have less than a month to build something, and they're not even introducing themselves to each other. So now we tell them, tell a little bit about yourself, exchange telephone number, contact information, and start drafting a team contract. The team contract should have a name for the team. It should have a mission for the team. It should explain how you're going to work together. And lastly, how you're going to resolve difficulties. In the beginning, students will write, if we have a problem, we'll go and talk to Professor Mazur, only to discover very quickly that we bounce the problem just straight back at them. Peter is not coming to class. We haven't seen him in a week. Have you thought of calling Peter? There might be something wrong with Peter. Oh, no, we have not done that. It's amazing, how people have to learn how to resolve difficulties and work together. So that's done right at the beginning for the first half hour. Then after a week or two, they have to submit a proposal. The idea there is to make sure that they go on to a productive path. It turns out that once you hook students on the project and you unleash their fantasy, their imagination, I should say, they go wild and they become way too ambitious. We often have to tone down their ambitions and say, look, you only have 3 weeks. You won't be able to do this. Or, they might fall into a trap. Like, for example, they might want to make a musical string instrument with fishing wire. Well, we know that fishing wire stretches and therefore doesn't hold a tune. So it's much better to give them $3 to buy real strings rather than to use fishing wire. After 3 weeks, so at the end of the project period, after 4 weeks from the beginning, so 3 weeks after the proposal, we have a fair. We tend to do the fair into a public place, the lobby of Maxwell Dworkin, or even outside if the weather is nice, so that other people see it, and it's a public and festive event. A week later, they have to submit a report written as a scientific publication. The first year we didn't specify that. What did we find? Students would take everything that they'd done, put a big staple through it, and hand in that as a report. They have no idea how to put a report. So now we provide them with the guidelines for a peer-reviewed scientific publication, and they have to adhere to those guidelines. Otherwise, we just reject the report. We give them, we quickly scan and read the reviews, give them feedback, and give them 3 days to improve the report, just as you do with a real scientific publication. And then at the end, it's time to give credit where credit is due, and they have to do an online evaluation of the team, of their peers, and themselves. And we put them in a prisoner's dilemma, which means they have to be honest, because if you're dishonest, since we can cross-correlate all of these assessment, you end up damaging yourself more than not. Again, I can't really go into the details, but I'm happy to discuss this later or show it to you if you come and visit the class. Let me show you a little YouTube video for one of these musical instruments.
We dedicated ourselves to designing a robust, creative, and economical flute for El Sistema. Our flute is 100% recycled, with the wooden dowel, the duct tape, the plastic, and the PVC all from the engineering lab, so our cost is zero. Our design is a modular tripartite design in which we combine 3 flutes in one, as thus we can interchange the different flutes for different notes and different scales.
So you can see how this sort of unleashes their imagination. They have to also have a little segment in the YouTube video where they explain how they've used physics to improve their instrument. I cut that out because otherwise it gets too long. And one other remark I should make. Clearly, in the design of the teams for this project, you need to take into account musical abilities. So before we form the teams, you need to ask the students whether they play an instrument, whether they can read music, and so on. Often we need to survey skills that are not directly relevant to the course and distribute ability so that no team is advantaged over another team. So let's now finally talk about the in-class components. Oh, before I do that, with this project, I really nailed the empathy thing quite well. I can't claim that we do it that well with other projects, but I found the perfect substitute: competition. If you can't find a good empathy or social good motivator for the project, then have the teams compete against each other. However, make sure that you make the competitive part not part of the assessment. Otherwise, students are going to, cut corner and it's going to become vicious. But students are perfectly happy to try to win a competition, even if it doesn't factor directly into the grade. So this was actually the project that you see on the background. It's one that is inspired by the Weizmann Institute and held annually, where students design a safe that has 4 opaque sides and 2 transparent sides that is held locked by principles of electromagnetism. And then during the fair, competing teams go to each other's, in rounds of 10 minutes, go to another team's safe, have to look through the transparent side, reverse engineer the electromagnetics that are inside in order to unlock the safe. And as you can see, this is a team that actually is giving high fives because they managed to unlock the safe of a competing team. Okay, so what about the in-class activities? First thing is that in a normal course, we have lecture. We have maybe 3 hours a week. We have lab, 2 hours a week. And then the discussion section, 1 hour a week. Students go back and forth between their other activities and this. Often the activities are not well integrated. The lab in particular. Many students go to the lab simply because they need the points to the lab. If they don't show up in the lab, they don't get a satisfactory grade, but there's no real assessment of the skills that are developed in the laboratory. So I said, you know what? I'm going to eliminate everything and just have one thing: class. So we'll meet twice a week for 3 hours. And in those 3 hours, we'll use a blend of 6 different best practices. They're color-coded and listed there. And essentially, they appeal to 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy, going from lower order thinking skills at the top to higher order thinking skills at the bottom. At the top, the 2 activities help students build understanding. On the left, learning catalytics, which is essentially peer instruction, is the only remnant of what I used to do in my course before. And then on the right, tutorials, which are worksheets that are designed to address misconceptions. In the middle, they get to apply their knowledge. On the left, an estimation activity, which is basically Fermi-type problems. They have to use qualitative reasoning skills to come up with orders of magnitude. And then what we call an experimental design activity, where they have to develop the skills, the experimental skills that are necessary for their project. So we might give them a project to learn how to make video and then extract kinematics graphs from the video. And at the bottom, we help them develop the ability to evaluate themselves. Homework on the left, but the homework is very different because it's focused on reflecting on your learning. It has an at-home part, which is just based on effort, and an in-class part that is based on improving your effort and assessing yourself. And then on the right, something we call a readiness assurance activity, euphemism for an exam, I guess, maybe, although it's a collaborative exam. Those of you who've seen my talk, Assessment, the Silent Killer of Learning, have seen a little video of how we do that. I'll say a little bit more about that later. So the schedule for a term looks like this. Each column, is a day starting from January 27th, going all the way to April 28th. I think actually this is this year's schedule. And you can see that there are sort of 3 repeating blocks. Each block is 1 project. In fact, right now we are in this project that you see highlighted right there. So let's blow that up. And you see that, 10 o'clock is at the top, 1 o'clock is at the bottom. You don't see that, it's not indicated. But you can see that we sort of fill in the beginning the 3 hours with these scaffolded, guided activities. The students do things that we prescribe. But then the rest of the 1/3 of the time in that period, which happens to be where we are right now, I think, yes, is unguided. I mean, essentially, we're there in the classroom if they want our help, but they're probably better off going to the machine shop or the teaching labs or build things because the fair is going to come up. This is the team intro where they have to start writing their team contract. The P means the proposal is due. And the numbers, by the way, refer to a unit of material in the textbook. And then at the end is the project fair. Okay, so how well has this worked? We've offered this course now a number of years. And I thought the best way to evaluate how well this course has worked is really to look at the outcomes. Remember, these were the outcomes I had in the beginning. And I'm going to start with the content learning goals because before I made this switch, that was actually the only thing I assessed. I don't really have solid data on any of these other outcomes for my traditional course. So let's start with the content learning goals. Well, we can use 2 different metrics. One is to use that conceptual surveys, like the Force Concept Inventory or the Conceptual Survey of Electricity and Magnetism, and look at the pre to post gain. So look how well the students, or poorly, the students do on day 1, and then repeat that at the end of the semester and see if they've gained. What got me to change my approach 25 years ago was when I discovered that in the classroom that I was teaching there, that gain was minimal. It was within the error bar that you see there. We were definitely outside the error bar. And if I compare it to Physics 11, when I taught it the last few times, or the last time actually, you see that the gain is pretty similar. And the same is actually true for exam problems. I took a couple of the exam problems from Physics 11 and put them on the readiness assurance activity and looked at the individual student performance so I could compare traditional problem-solving skills in the 2 environments. So this is AP 50, and here is Physics 11. So I think it's fair to say that we've not made any sacrifices in content knowledge. Okay. Oh, I'm one slide ahead. It's pretty similar between the two. Okay, so next let's go to self-directed learning. And there I have I have no data in the traditional setting because we simply did not collect any data. How do we know that the students actually take their reading seriously? I'm going to show you some data, which I find pretty mind-boggling, frankly. You know, before that, if I would just tell my students, read a chapter before coming to class, you know, maybe 40% does the reading. If I tell them, read this chapter before class because I'm going to examine you, maybe a little bit more will reading, but some will have the book on their knees while they're doing the quiz. If I use just-in-time teaching, I can get that maybe a little bit higher, but look at what happens with this social learning platform. I'm going to show on the vertical the percentage of students out of 100. I'm going to show on the horizontal the number of chapters that they missed reading throughout the term. There were 17 chapters that they had to read. So this graph extends all the way to the wall on your right. But I didn't show it because it's all 0. The different shadings are 3 different semesters where we were fiddling with the rubric for evaluation and sort of the feedback mechanism to the students. The black bars are the most recent one. Notice that 70% of the students misses 0 chapters. They read and annotate each and every chapter with thoughtful questions. If you add the 3 first bars together, I mean, students are sick sometimes, or you know, they may have an interview, some are seniors, or they may have an exam in another course. I mean, even we miss deadlines sometimes, right? So it's not unfair to expect students to miss some things too. But if you add those 3 bars, you get to close to 95%. You know, which is probably as close as you can get to getting every student ready for every class. I think even threatening them with a gun wouldn't get these data much higher. We also know by just tracking the metrics in the browser that they use, that you know about 81% spend 2 to 6 hours per week reading. 2 to 6 hours per week reading. Here's what one student wrote in an interview. I think the perusal app and annotation system is way better than just reading the textbook normally. I've been reading for almost 4 hours now and I haven't gotten bored. Of course, the student forgot it's my textbook, so I'm just kidding. Okay, another thing is the homework. As I said, the homework has 2 parts. An at-home phase, where we purely evaluate on effort, and they have to follow Polya's prescription. How many of you are familiar with Polya's beautiful book? It was a mathematician in the 50s here in the United States, How to Solve It. He sort of prescribes an organized, stepwise approach to solving problems. Getting started, devise a plan, execute a plan, evaluate your answer. Essentially, we ask the students just to write down these 4 steps for each problem. And we tell them you're going to be evaluated on effort. Well, the good thing is there's no way to fake effort. You do it or you don't do it. We found that some students walked into class with 25 pages of homework. I'd never seen it. I've learned out that if you want your students to do something, simply develop a rubric. And then don't forget to give them the rubric, because otherwise they won't do it. So clearly, students put in the effort, provided they are properly rewarded. What about teamwork? Well, we have many metrics of teamwork. I'm just going to show one of you because I need to wrap up here. I told you about the readiness assurance activity. It's essentially an exam, except it's a collaborative exam. First, the students get 40 minutes to solve 10 problems individually, entering the answers to the 10 problems. Then I press on a button, and on their computer screen, they see for each question the answers that all of their team members give. They might all be wrong. They might not be wrong. They don't know. If all have the same answer, chances are that that answer is correct. So then they have to answer the questions again. If on the first attempt it's right, the team gets 4 points. If it's wrong, the computer immediately tells that, and they get a second attempt, which, if it's right, gets 2 points. If it's wrong again, they can try a third time for 1 point. If it's wrong again, they get 0 points, but then the solution is revealed. I'm going to show you some data that sort of gives some kind of insight into teamwork, because this cannot be ascribed to either copying answers or not working together, because you have to work together. On the vertical, I'm going to show the percentage of teams getting correct answers. On the horizontal are the number of team members in that team who are correct in the individual round. So on the far left, you see teams where in the individual round, not one single team member had the right answer. In the middle, 1 out of 4 or 5, because we have teams of 4 and 5, has the right answer. And on the right, 2 or more. I lumped them all together there. So the first attempt, you see this. The second attempt, it goes up to that. And the third attempt, it goes up to the white points. Now let's first start on the right. Notice that if 2 or more students have the right answer individually, and that's perhaps not that surprising, these are, by the way, these are not multiple choice questions. These are open-ended questions. They have to enter an equation or a number with the correct units, or draw a vector, or identify graphically something, right? So there's no guessing from answer, because it's not multiple choice. So if 2 people have the right answer, individual team, then quickly the whole team gets it right. In fact, within 1 round, you get nearly 100%. But now look on the far left. Nobody has the right answer. Yet on the first attempt, 25% gets it right. Let's say the 4 of us on our team, we're all wrong. David points out the flaws in my reasoning. I point out the flaws in, no, Dudley can never be wrong, sorry. Dudley's reasoning. They all have to sort of find ways of arguing that the other one is wrong and then come to the right. Isn't that absolutely amazing, right? And if they get it right, if they get it wrong, pardon me, then in 1 or 2 rounds, they go up to almost 60% with nobody correct the first time. Here are some quotes from the team assessment. We were all very committed to pulling our own weight. So when somebody knew they hadn't done as much work on one part, they volunteered to take more on the next. Wouldn't you want your colleagues to be like that? And here's another one. I think the fact that we all had experience working in groups like these, this was for the 3rd project in the fall. So the music project, which is a little bit shorter than the other one, so they have less time, was very helpful, especially since we had less time to form team identity given the shorter time frame of this project. We all recognize each other's strengths and weaknesses without needing to spell them out, and I think we capitalized on those effectively throughout the project. What about professionalism? The attendance, I think, is above the theoretical maximum. We have typically in the high 90s. Students come to class sick. We have to tell them, go home. Why do they come to class sick? Not because we take attendance and we give them points. No, because they don't want to let their team members down. They want to act professionally with their team members, just as, we're compelled to go and participate in committee meetings and other things. Let me end here by talking about ownership, because that was the design goal of this whole course. The course, in spite of being a requirement and not an elective, has had a pretty steady evaluation between 3.9 and 4.2 out of 5, which I think for a required course is quite high, especially given the fact that we have quite a few pre-meds in the course. Here are some comments. The structure of the class made what was my least favorite subject into one of my favorites. I was worried that people, including myself, would just slack off and do the bare minimum. But you really need to be on top of your readings and concepts in order to contribute to your team. Great class. Here's another. Listen to this. The person addressed, this was in the Q guide, addressed to other Harvard students. Dear Harvard students, this class will be unlike any class you've taken at Harvard, and it will, hopefully, shift the entire foundation upon which you've based your education. I truly believe everyone should take this course. And now listen to this. Prepare to take full ownership of your learning. When I read that, I got a huge smile on my face. Isn't it beautiful to see one of your design goals echoed back by the students? And another thing, 3 hours and they don't leave. Now they have to leave because another class comes in, but before the classroom was heavily used, we literally had to shove them out of the classroom to clean up because they get so hooked on what they're doing. Let me add with one little tidbit of data. Self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is your belief in being able to succeed in a certain domain. I'm sure all of you have a very high self-efficacy in physics. You need this high self-efficacy because that's the only way to progress. If you have a high self-efficacy and you fail at something within that domain, you tend to explain it by blaming yourself. I didn't study enough, or I just had a bad day. If you have low self-efficacy, you tend to tell yourself, oh, this is too hard for me, I can't do it. So we all have a pretty high self-efficacy in the sciences, probably, but in some other domains, we might have very low self-efficacy. If you ask me now to dance in front of you, I'd probably be very embarrassed, and after a while, I'd tell myself, I can't do it. It's not good for me. It's not something I can do well. I have low ballet or dancing self-efficacy. So when I first measured self-efficacy was in Physics 11B. This is the pre and the post. These are data from my class in Science Center B, using peer instruction, doing my best, engaging the students in the classroom. And it went down. Not statistically significant, but it went down. I know I was destroyed by these data until somebody pointed out to me, these are very good data. Typically in an introductory physics course, self-efficacy plunges down for non-majors, not for majors, but for non-majors. In AP 50, I'm happy to report that self-efficacy goes up, statistically significantly up. So I want to end with this picture I started out with. Look at these students. Notice the smiles on their faces. They're not smiling because of the photographer. They were probably not even aware there was a photographer. They had 10 minutes to crack open this safe. They just were actually enjoying themselves. So I think it is actually possible to create ownership of learning, even for non-majors, and to make the learning fun again. In fact, something happened that had never happened before. The word fun appeared over and over and over in the comments in the evaluation. I'd never seen the word fun appear in evaluations of my introductory course. Here's one student. You come out with so much knowledge and experience and fun. And isn't that the way education should be? I want to end by expressing gratitude to a number of individuals who've really helped me enormously. First of all, Cherry Murray, the former dean of SEAS, who sort of provided me this opportunity and believed in me and supported me in this endeavor. Then Kelly Miller. Kelly, where are you? Kelly is hiding in the back there. Kelly Miller, who is now co-teaching the course and who helped me design the course, and also Orad Reshef, one of my graduate students, who I don't know if he's here. Are you here, Orad? No, he's not. Got to talk to him. Then Caroline Colecci, who helped me implement this course the first time, and my colleague Federico Capasso, as well as many people in the teaching staff, and of course the students themselves for their willingness to put up with this experiment. And lastly, I'd like to invite you to come and visit. I promise you one thing. After visiting our class, you will walk away thinking, Eric Mazur is teaching kindergarten. And I think that's the way it should be. Thank you very much.